Good evening. Out here, we're going to continue our study of the Old Testament, talking about how to use the Old Testament. And actually tonight, we're actually going to get to that. I told you we'd be studying how to use the Old Testament, and we really haven't done that too much yet, but I plan to this evening. What we've been doing for the last 3 days is laying the foundation. We've talked about the giving of the law through Moses to the children of Israel. Then we've been talking about the fulfillment of the law through Jesus Christ. And we're not quite done with that. Yesterday, we went through piece by piece, theme by theme, talking about how the law of Moses really has been fulfilled in every way, in every facet. The law of Moses has been fulfilled through Jesus Christ. And what we were talking about yesterday as we ended our study is that this is good. This is very good that the law has come to an end. Not that it was just thrown away, not that it was destroyed, but it has been fulfilled and finished. And in that sense, it's become obsolete. And what we were talking about is why that was absolutely necessary for that to be the case. The first thing we talked about yesterday, the first reason that it was necessary for the law to come to an end, was because the law was limited by the flesh. I'll just read this passage again from Romans 8, verses 3 and 4. Romans 8, 3 and 4, for what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God did. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh on account of sin, he condemned sin in the flesh that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So we said yesterday that the law was weak, not because it was imperfectly designed in some way, but because of our human flesh. Law cannot change the human flesh. Law cannot conquer the human flesh. So in order for us to be saved, the flesh had to be conquered not through the law, but through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So that was one reason there had to be a change. The second thing we began to talk about yesterday, another necessary reason for the law to be taken out of the way, was because the law, by design, excluded the Gentiles from Israel. So this is the passage we were looking at. Ephesians 2, verses 13 through 16. I'd like to go ahead and read this again. Ephesians 2, 13 to 16. But now, in Christ Jesus, you, talking to Gentiles, who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing, this is referring to the law, by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. So notice how Jews and Gentiles are reconciled. Jews and Gentiles are not reconciled through the law. Jews and Gentiles are reconciled through the cross. And in fact, for that to be possible, the law had to be taken out of the way. The law by design, this is the last thing we were talking about. The law by design excluded the Gentiles from Israel. We talked about the Passover as an example. The Passover was for the children of Israel. Gentiles were not allowed to participate in the Passover. If a Gentile did want to participate in the Passover, they had to be circumcised and in some sense assimilate into Judaism. Another example of how the law of Moses excluded Gentiles. Some people from the nations were permanently excluded from citizenship and cooperation with Israel. There were Gentiles who in some sense joined Israel, but there were also Gentiles who never were allowed to join Israel. This comes from Deuteronomy 23 verses 1 through 3. No one whose testicles are crushed or whose male organ is cut off shall enter the assembly of the Lord. No one born of a foreign union may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever. So this is the wall of hostility, the wall of exclusion between Jews and Gentiles. These decrees that were codified in the law of Moses excluded the Gentiles, especially Ammonites and Moabites, excluded them from the covenants of promise and prohibited any meaningful union between Jews and Gentiles. So I used to read this passage from Ephesians 3 talking about this wall of hostility and how it was a dividing wall, a barrier between Jews and Gentiles. I used to read that passage in Ephesians 3, and it was completely hypothetical to me. I thought, this has never applied to me, never will apply to me, until it did. Until I met my neighbors, I've told you about several times, until I met them. These people who are attempting to observe the Mosaic Law in some way. It was all hypothetical until I met them. I told you this movement in some circles is called the Hebrew Roots movement, although it's got different names and different forms in different places. I told you they do believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but they're still observing Sabbaths, the holy days, circumcision, dietary laws, and literally everything. And it's only been in those relationships that I finally was able to appreciate what Paul was talking about. How the law really is a wall between Jews and Gentiles. With my neighbors, there are many ordinary, neighborly things that we cannot do together because the law is dividing us. We can't invite them over to our house for a meal because our kitchen is not clean according to the Mosaic Law. If they're ever sick or down and out for one reason or another, we cannot bring them a meal for the same reason. We can't even offer them hand-me-down clothing because our clothing almost always includes mixed materials, which is forbidden by the law of Moses. And we can barely spend time with them on the weekends because they're observing the Sabbath on Saturday and we're observing the Lord's Day on Sunday. So from their perspective, the only path to unity and fellowship is if we also convert to the Mosaic Law. So you see what I'm saying? This all felt hypothetical until it wasn't. Until I met people who really are divided from me because of this wall of hostility. But this is the wall and the law that, according to Paul's words, was torn down and abolished by Christ. But it was abolished in the sense that it was fulfilled. That wall had a very important purpose for a specific period of time, but that time is finished. That wall of division was taken out of the way because it had to be taken out of the way. So one more reason that the law had to be taken away is one that we've already talked about quite a lot, and that is that the law produces sin, guilt, and death. That's what it ends in. Law results in sin, guilt, and death. It does not result in righteousness and unity with God. And this is what Paul was talking about in Romans 7, verses 8 through 12. But sin, taking opportunity by the commandment, produced in me. This is what the law did. The law produced in me. Sin, because of the law, I should say, sin because of the law, produced in me all manner of evil desire. For apart from the law, Paul says, sin was dead. I was once alive without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment which was to bring life, I found to bring death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and it killed me. Therefore, the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. So notice what he's saying there in verse 12. The law was not evil in any way. The law was holy. The commandment was holy, just, and good. The problem was the law stirred up sinful desires, but had no power to overcome those sinful desires. So the law defined sin, which makes us all guilty of sin, which in the end makes us all condemned to die. That is the only outcome of the law. So if we don't want to be condemned to die, we need something other than the law. We have to be governed by something else besides the law. That is the end of the discussion I had prepared on the fulfillment of the law. And the next thing I want to go into is the thing I told you we were going to talk about, which is actually how to use the law, how to use the Old Testament. But before I do that, let me give you a chance to make any comments or ask any questions. Anything left over from yesterday or anything that you want me to make sure and talk about before we go into the new subject? All right, we'll carry on. So given everything we've said so far about the origin of the law of Moses and the fulfillment of the law of Moses through Christ, now we can talk about how we're supposed to use it. And I'll start by giving you an analogy. A few years ago, my brother Jeremy and I were setting some very long concrete forms. Both of us had done that for a summer when we were 18, 19 years old, of course, at different times. But both of us had done that before. We had helped to set concrete forms in the process of building concrete walls for basements. And so Jeremy and I were doing that. We were setting these very long forms, and of course, they needed to be level. This was for a 24 by 36 building that we were working on. And Jeremy and I agreed that the best tool for leveling these concrete forms was something that I'm going to call a surveyor's level, which in this case was a laser surveyor's level. We agreed this is obviously the right tool for the job. We had seen that tool used 100 times, maybe thousands of times. We knew that was the tool we needed. So we went and rented one. Well, it turns out that despite our confidence in the tool, neither of us had actually ever used a surveyor's level before. We'd seen it used. It looked easy enough. But as we started to use it, anyone watching us try to use the tool would have immediately known that we had never actually used one before. Eventually, we thought we had it figured out. But it's not good enough to just think you've got it figured out when you're setting these forms. It's got to be right, but we weren't sure if it was right. So, to confirm that we were using the surveyor's level correctly, we just got out a regular old carpenter's level, a 4-foot-long carpenter's level. And even though that's not exactly the right tool for the job, we knew that if we were using the surveyor's level correctly, the carpenter's level should agree. If they were in agreement with each other, that meant we were using the surveyor's level correctly. And like I said, you can't really use a 4-foot carpenter's level to level a 36-foot wall. You could easily be off by several inches, and then you've got a big problem in your building. But you can use that carpenter's level to just double check your work. You can use it to confirm that you're using the other tool, the right tool, correctly. And I like that analogy in my own mind because that is exactly how I view the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We cannot use the Old Testament to define all of the doctrines of the church. That's the wrong tool for the job, but we can use it to double check the doctrines of the New Testament church. We should be able, my point is, we should be able to interpret the Old Testament and the New Testament in a way that is in agreement. The specific requirements of the Old Testament and New Testament are not exactly the same, but they're similar because it's the same God. And the general things that He wants out of His people remains the same. And so that's the principal way that we can use the Old Testament. We verify our understanding of the New Testament when we can confirm that it agrees with the nature of God as observed in the Old Testament. If we ever interpret the New Testament in a way that is radically different from God's standards in the Old Testament, something is wrong. You see what I mean by that? Either we don't understand the New Testament or we don't understand the Old Testament. If they appear to be in complete disagreement with each other, then something has gone wrong. If the surveyor's level does not agree with the carpenter's level, then one of them is not being used correctly. And that's the same approach that we need to take as we go into the law of Moses. So let's go into this. How are we using the Old Testament? How are you using the law of Moses? And to begin that point, I want to reiterate the very first thing I said in our Bible study on Monday. The reason that the Old Testament is worth studying is because we're supposed to. We're supposed to study the Old Testament. We're supposed to be looking at the law of Moses. I'll give you two verses that we mentioned back on Monday. Paul said in Romans 10, verse 14, "For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures we might have hope." So, of course, when he talked about that which was written before, he's referring to the Old Testament. He's talking about the law of Moses, and he's telling us all of that was written down for our sake, for our learning. It's supposed to be studied. It's supposed to be understood. We're supposed to use it in the right way in the church. Another passage that we spent a good deal of time talking about was 2 Timothy 3, verse 16, when Paul said, "All Scripture is given by the inspiration of God and is profitable." All Scripture includes all Scripture, including the Old Testament. It is profitable even for Christian people. Of course, we do need to sort out the right ways to use the Old Testament, but it is profitable. It is useful to us. I was involved in a discussion not too long ago where we were talking about the authority of elders in the church, and a comment was made comparing the New Testament elders to the judges of the Mosaic Law. And when that comment was made, there was an objection to that. The comment was, that's the old law. That's the Mosaic Law. That has no bearing on what we do in the church. And that is exactly the attitude that is the problem. Paul is saying we are supposed to refer to the law and the Old Testament as we understand our present condition in the church. And as I said on Monday, you're using the Old Testament even when you're using the New Testament. It is not possible to only read the New Testament. Almost every book of the New Testament includes direct quotes or obvious allusions to the Old Testament. So when you read through the New Testament, you're also reading the Old Testament. Jesus routinely referenced the Old Testament in his teachings. And it wasn't just because he was a Jew speaking to Jews. It's because of what we've been talking about this week. Because the Mosaic Law lays the foundation for the Christian system. When you go through the writings of the Apostle Paul, he routinely referenced the Old Testament when providing New Testament principles. And that's really what we're going to examine in detail. I do think the point is very simple, straightforward, self-evident, but really the hard part is nailing down the exact details. How exactly are we as Christians supposed to use the Old Testament? God has done us a great benefit in telling us and giving us examples of how exactly to use the Old Testament. What are the specific ways that we look into the Old Testament and apply those principles to the Christian age? And what we're going to start with is using the Old Testament to define sin and righteousness. We talked about on Monday that the definition of sin and righteousness, or maybe this was Tuesday and Wednesday, I'm not sure what day it was, but at some point this week, we talked about how the definition of sin and righteousness between the Old Testament and the Testament is fundamentally the same. And so the Old Testament is very useful when talking about sin. We're supposed to use the Old Testament when we're learning about and talking about sin. A really great example of this is over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 6 through 11. This is where Paul is teaching us that we should use the Old Testament to learn the outcome of sin. This is 1 Corinthians 10, verses 6 through 11. Paul says, "Now these things became our examples," talking to Christians, "to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted," talking about the Jews. "And do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained, and were destroyed by the destroyer." Now, all of these things happened to them as examples, and then listen to this, "and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." I really like how Paul ends that discourse in verse 11. We are supposed to be admonished by the example of the Jews. God didn't have to record their history and preserve it for us, but he did. We learn from their disobedience. We can observe the human nature that was in them so we can see it better in ourselves. That's why God left behind all these stories. It's really easy to look at the stories of the Jewish people and just wonder to ourselves, how could they have possibly done that? How could they have possibly defected from God so quickly after seeing all of those miracles? What we're supposed to learn is that is our nature. That is the nature of human beings. It's not a Jewish nature, it's the human nature. And so Paul is explicitly telling us these things were written for our sakes. The specific expectation in these situations is sometimes the same as God's expectations now. Sometimes it's a little different, but the overall lesson is always exactly the same. The penalty for disobedience is always the same. The Old Testament can also help us in some more specific ways. And this is an idea that was introduced to me just a few months ago, and I'm happy to share it with you. A very specific way that we use the Old Testament is defining specific sins such as sexual immorality. So go back to Acts chapter 15 and think about the situation there. That whole debate in Acts chapter 15 was about how to use the law. Whether or not Gentiles, when they came to Christ, the debate was about whether or not Gentiles, when they came to Christ, do they need to be circumcised and keep the law? That was the question. That context is very important. And in the process of debating that issue about what elements from the Mosaic law needed to be applied to the Gentiles, it was James who stepped forward to settle the debate, and he said this in Acts 15, verses 19 and 20. Therefore, I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. So this is very clear. 4 things are prohibited, 3 depending on how you count, 3 or 4 things prohibited for the Gentiles. Uniquely Jewish things, not necessarily issues of the conscience, but unique items from the Mosaic law that were not well understood among the Gentiles. These 4 things were prohibited. The consuming of things that had been polluted by idols. They also needed to abstain from sexual immorality, things strangled, and from blood. All of that is very straightforward except for one. Except for sexual immorality. We know what those words mean. It obviously refers to immoral sexual relationships, sexual behaviors. But what is that? If we went and surveyed people in our community, how do you define inappropriate sexual behavior? Are you going to get the same answers? Obviously not. Obviously not. Sexual immorality is something that God defines. It requires a biblical definition. And the Old Testament should be used to define that, because that's the issue at hand in Acts chapter 15. So then we need to go back to the Mosaic law and say, well, what was sexual immorality under the Mosaic law? Because that's what they were talking about in the context here. So when we go back to the law of Moses, we get very clear descriptions of sexual immorality. Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, Deuteronomy 22, and other passages, we get many examples of forbidden sexual relationships. Things like adultery, premarital relationships, prostitution, bestiality, incest, and homosexuality, and others. Every exercise of sexual appetite outside of marriage is a sin. And if there's any question about what that constitutes, we can go back to the Old Testament and we get a divine definition of sexual immorality. So the implication in the New Testament is that anything outside of marriage is wrong. And if there's any question about that, we can go back to the Old Testament and get a specific definition. I find that very helpful. When the dots were connected to me, I felt like that made a lot of sense. So we've got things like that. If we have any question about the kinds of sins that God is talking about in the New Testament, a lot of times we can go back to the Old Testament and we can make sense of it. Another specific way that we can use the Old Testament and use the law of Moses is when we're developing our understanding of church government and order in the church. I'll give you a specific example. The Mosaic Law, according to the Apostle Paul, the Mosaic Law is supposed to inform how we understand the role of men and women in the church. Paul uses the law to prove his point when he's talking about these distinctions in 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34. That whole chapter, he's talking about the appropriate way for people to address the assembly. Who can address the assembly of the church, the appropriate way and the appropriate time for people to address the assembly of the church. And then he's got this note in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34, let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. They are to be submissive. And then he says, as the law also says. So he gives us this prohibition, this limitation, which is not only a limitation on women, it's also a burden put on men. So we need to look at it both ways. It's not just a limitation. It's a role distinction. And Paul is saying that this is in agreement with the law. This rule that I'm giving you about the assembly and who can address the assembly, he says this is from the law. This agrees with the law of Moses. So what does the law say about women speaking in the church, women speaking in the assembly? Well, it doesn't say anything about it. Not exactly. But the law does lay out a pattern that defines the relationship between men and women. And that goes all the way back to the beginning in Genesis 3, verse 16. This is probably the sort of thing that Paul was thinking about when he says, as the law also says. Genesis 3, verse 16, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. A hierarchy already existed at creation, but this hierarchy was compounded at this time. There is a relationship between men and women that comes from God that is codified in the law. And Paul is saying that this order that we have in the church, it does go back to rules that originated in the law. Another really interesting passage that somehow I had forgotten existed in the Bible is Numbers chapter 30 and the rules about women and their vows. I don't know how many times I must have read this and just read right over it, not given it any thought, not thought about the implication it had, but I want to read it to you just because I found it so interesting the first time I read it. And this is also talking about the relationship between men and women. This is Numbers 30, verses 10 through 13. If she vowed in her husband's house or bound herself by an agreement with an oath, and her husband heard it, and made no response to her, and did not overrule her, then all her vows shall stand, and every agreement by which she bound herself shall stand. But if her husband truly made them void on the day he heard them, then whatever proceeded from her lips concerning her vows or concerning the agreement binding her, it shall not stand. Her husband has made them void, and the Lord will release her. Then verse 13, every vow and every binding oath to afflict her soul, her husband may confirm it, or her husband may make it void. So this doesn't necessarily have any direct bearing on the assembly itself, but it's verifying the idea that from the beginning of time, starting with creation and throughout the law of Moses, God is giving us examples of what headship in the family is supposed to look like. The husband and the father has the obligation to be the leader of the family, even to the extent of confirming or voiding vows of his wife or daughters. And this just confirms the idea and order of authority. Okay, so those are general things about the relationship between men and women. But what about speaking in the church? What does the law say about that? The law says nothing about women addressing the assembly of Israel, and that may be the exact point that Paul is getting to. Do you see what I'm saying? There is never an instance of women addressing the assembly of Israel, and Paul may be saying, in the same way that the assembly was handled then, that's how we're going to handle our business in the church now. When you go through the Old Testament, we've got numerous examples of Moses, Joshua, David, Solomon, Ezra, and many others speaking to the assembly. And so the Old Testament pattern is that the men would lead and preside over the gatherings of Israel. So what about the women of Israel? Does that mean that the women of Israel did nothing? That they were unimportant in the Mosaic covenant? Is that what that means? You know, hopefully everybody knows the answer I'm looking for. Obviously, no. Women were very, very important in the activities of the Mosaic covenants, but they did not preside over the assembly. They did not speak to the assembly. Even a woman like Deborah, the judge, how did Deborah do her judging? Was she standing on street corners pronouncing God's judgments to the people? How did she do her judging? Who knows? That's right. She sat under Deborah's tree, and the people came to her. So this is discussed in Judges 4, verses 4 and 5. A very important and influential woman, but she did not address the assembly of Israel in the same way that men did. This is Judges 4, verses 4 and 5. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time, and she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim, and the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. So it's not that women were insignificant. It's not that they were less wise or less intelligent. We all know that that's not true. But they did function in a disparate capacity when it came to the assembly of Israel. There's also a prophetess in 2 Kings 22 that does a lot of work advising the king's men, but she does not address the whole assembly of Israel. And so what I'm getting to is we could look at New Testament passages like 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy chapter 2. We could look at those passages that create these limitations, and we could wonder to ourselves, does that actually mean what it says? Does this actually mean that men need to take the leading role and that women should not speak in the assembly? Is that actually what it's saying? And the answer is yes. That's definitely what it's saying, because that's the same pattern that we have out of the Old Testament. We can confirm that it does mean what it says because the New Testament pattern agrees with the Old Testament pattern. I'm going way faster than I thought I would go. Do you have any comments or questions right now? Go ahead, Alina.
I thought about bringing this earlier. Just to remind you, you mentioned how not baptism.
It's what happens in our baptism. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I thought it was interesting. Relevant to men.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. I do think we should take something from that, because you're exactly right. Circumcision of the Mosaic covenant applied only to the men. The men were the heads of their households. They were representatives of the whole family. If a man converted to Judaism, to the extent that that was possible, it was 100% the husband's choice. It was his choice to be circumcised and bring the family under the Mosaic covenant to the extent that that was possible. And that is a change in the new covenant. A man does not convert to Christianity on behalf of his family. Men and women are saved independently. They make their own choice, and that's a very big deal. At the time of Christ, not talking about Christianity, but in Judaism, at the time of Christ, women were never disciples. It was always men who were disciples. They were the one who were the students of this or that rabbi, this or that teacher. And so when you get to the book of Acts and women are called disciples, that's a really big deal, because that was not the tradition under Judaism. That was not the tradition under the Greek and Roman worlds. So I don't know if I'm saying what you thought I was going to say, but I think that's a very important point. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Yes, go ahead, please. Yes. It's talking about any vow. Yeah, I think it's talking about any vow. There were some vows that were connected to the law of Moses, like men or women could take the Nazirite vow as an example. So it's definitely talking about vows that were in line with the Mosaic law, but I imagine there's other vows or oaths or agreements that women could make. Another example would maybe be like an agreement to buy a piece of property, an agreement to purchase something. And it sounds like what this passage is saying is, if the husband hears his wife making an agreement to purchase a piece of property, if he says nothing, then the agreement stands. But he, as the husband, has the right to say, no, we're not going to do that. I think that's the kind of thing that was happening. Very good question. Other comments or questions? I don't want to know. I'm not going to ask. Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of things I don't want to know, because, the longer you think about it, the more disturbing it gets, because that is not life in the spirit. That's life in the flesh. And there's all kinds of obscene things that happen to any person who is living in the flesh. So, I don't even want to know. That's a great question. Other questions or comments?
It's interesting, but probably not that. Really, is a lot of it is not a story about commanded wasn't stepping up and doing what he's supposed to do.
That's exactly right.
Never a created promise of God. And when she goes to Barrett, it almost sounds like God has told Barrett.
Yes.
She says, has not the Lord said
Yeah.
to go and do this? And he says, I'll go. You go with me.
Yeah. Will you hold my hand, please? Then I'll go. Yeah.
So today's, you tell us, read the story today's sometimes where a man won't do it, God. And then the woman, still there.
Yeah.
No, this is not the right move.
Yeah.
And never do it.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
Whole song.
Yeah. And that, again, is why it's so valuable for us to read the Old Testament, because we can make these connections. The Old Testament and the New Testament are in agreement. All right, let's carry on. Another very specific way that we can use the Old Testament. Somebody told me the other day that if I wanted to make this more interesting, I could introduce some controversy. So here you go. There is an ongoing disagreement within churches of Christ about how, quote, church money should be used. And you know all the questions that I'm thinking of. Should church funds be used for church members only? Or can church funds be used for people outside of the church? Can it be used for food, for kitchens, for fellowship spaces? I'm not even necessarily going to answer all those questions. I'm just saying those are the questions, right? You've heard those questions before. How can we or should we use the funds of the church? There's also a question among churches of Christ about how church resources can be used. Like, what about the building and other things that are owned by the church? I'm aware of some people who require that church resources, the property, the building, be used exclusively for the work of the church. No borrowing tables and chairs, no using the building for anything other than the business of the church. There's people who believe that. But the difficulty in that is the work of the church can be defined in slightly different ways, which results in different uses and different limitations. So, one of the things that we commonly do when we're talking about church finances and the appropriate biblical ways to use church funds is we go through every passage of the New Testament. But in this study, did you do the same thing with the Old Testament? Did you also go through every passage in the Old Testament, looking for patterns and agreements between the Old Testament and the New Testament? So, don't worry, I am not going to take us through every passage about the funding and resources of the children of Israel, but we will look at just a few. And the first point we need to make is we're supposed to do that. The law is supposed to inform how the church uses its resources. For example, Paul references Deuteronomy 25:4 to demonstrate that preachers of the gospel should be supported by the local church. Here's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 7 through 11. Whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruits, who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock. Do I say these things as a mere man, or does not the law say the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written. That he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of this hope, of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, it is a great thing if we reap your material things. So Paul is making this point about how evangelists can be supportive. And he says, this is no great thing that evangelists can be supported by the finances of the church because the law speaks about this kind of thing. The law is not the absolute authority on church finances, but it is a divine resource that should be consulted. Do you see how there is a careful way we need to say that? The law is not a final authority on how we use church resources, but I do believe it should be consulted because that's exactly what the Apostle Paul was doing here. We can be confident in our understanding of the new covenant when it agrees with the old covenant. So I want to take a moment and look at the pattern in the Old Testament. How was it in the Old Testament that funds were collected, used, and distributed among the children of Israel? And most of these things are things that you know very well. We'll just hit some of the highlights. The law, as you know, ordered tithing of material offerings. Tithing of material offerings. This is Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 and 23. You shall surely tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. And you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain and your new wine and your oil, of the firstborn of your herds and your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. So there was a tithe of material offerings. However, if they didn't want to supply that tithe of a material offering, they could replace it with a tithe of money. An Israelite could give a tithe of money in place of the tithe of his goods and livestock. This comes from Leviticus 27, verses 30 and 33. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. If a man wants at all to redeem any of his tithes, that means to buy back that tithes of goods and produce, he shall add 1/5 to it. And concerning the tithe of the herd or the flock, of whatever passes under the rod, the 10th one shall be holy to the Lord. He shall not inquire whether it is good or bad, nor shall he exchange it. And if he exchanges it at all, then both it and the one exchanged, for it shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. So some things could be redeemed, some things could not be redeemed. But the point is, under certain circumstances, God did allow them to buy back their produce that would have gone for the tithe. They could buy it back and replace it with money. So here's the point I want us to take from that. In the Mosaic system, a tithe of goods and produce and a tithe of money were fundamentally the same thing. They accomplished the same thing. And what was the thing that was being accomplished by those tithes? What was being done with those tithes? Where were they going to, or who were they going to? Yeah, they're going to the priest and to all of the Levites. The tithes were primarily used to meet the needs of the priest, the Levites, and support the ministry that was taking place at the temple. So this comes from Numbers 18, verses 20 and 21. Then the Lord said to Aaron, "You shall have no inheritance in the land, nor shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the children of Israel. Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes in Israel as an inheritance, in return for the work which they perform, the work of the tabernacle of meeting." So the thing that we see here is most of the tithe went to the Levites. However, it was not exclusively for the Levites. We learn about this exception that comes from in Deuteronomy 14. There was an exception. The law included a provision for strangers within the gates to benefit from the tithes of Israel that had been collected. This is Deuteronomy 14, verses 27 to 29. "You shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. At the end of every 3rd year, you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow who are within your gates, may come and eat and be satisfied, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do." So these tithes, like I said, primarily went to the Levites. But every 3rd year, those tithes, instead of being sent off to the tabernacle, instead of being sent off to the temple, every 3rd year, the tithes were kept back in their communities to fulfill the needs of the people that were within the gate. They weren't sending off their tithes to distant people among the Moabites and the Ammonites. They were keeping their tithes inside of their own communities to serve the people within the gates, even the non-Israelites. So, what does that tell us? Are there any principles that we're supposed to make on these scriptures? Does this in any way inform our view of church finances? It might. It might tell us something about church finances. So a few conclusions that I think we can make from this. The practice of giving and receiving in the church isn't really limited to our Sunday collection and the church treasury. Sometimes we think of it that way, but that's not how it worked in the Old Law, and that's definitely not how it worked in the New Testament either. In both the Old Testament and the New Testament, giving was not just about monetary exchanges. For example, the apostles were supported with food and clothing and housing when they went and preached the gospel during the ministry of Jesus. That comes from Matthew 10, verses 9 through 11. It's called a wage. Jesus says a worker is worthy of his wage. But nobody was paying them money, but they were being paid. They were supporting with food, clothing, and housing while they were preaching the gospel. That was a real offering. These gifts met their needs without any monetary exchanges. So this also agrees with Acts 4, verses 32 and 35. The point I'm making right now is monetary exchanges and exchanges of goods or even services, those count too. That has real value in the resources of the church. This is Acts 4, 32 to 35. Now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. And with great power, the apostles gave witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And great grace was upon them all. Nor was there anyone among them who lacked. For all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of the things that were sold and laid them at the apostles' feet. And they distributed to each one as anyone had need. So the church shared freely all of their things with each other. Every possession of every member was freely available to every other member as needed. Does that point make sense? It wasn't just about supporting each other with money. That's not the only way that the church supports itself. Every possession of every member was available to other members as needed. That is a real, legitimate offering. The treasury of the church, what I'm saying, is not limited to financial offerings. There is nothing in our lives that we can say, that's mine, I have no obligation to share. Do you see what I'm saying? There is nothing that we can say, it's mine, I've already given my money to the church, but the rest of this is mine. That was not true in the Mosaic Law, and that's not true in the church. When you look at these passages, what was the purpose of the giving of this money and these resources? The purpose was to meet the needs of members, whatever those needs might be. Any need of the members of the body, including, not least of all, the most basic needs like food, clothing, housing, money. Funds were collected by church leaders and distributed to individuals as needed. So this sets a few precedents for us. One precedent it sets is that it makes sense to have a common treasury, which almost all churches do. It makes sense to have a common treasury of funds to supply and meet needs as they arise. So we look at those things, and what I'm saying is there's agreement. There's agreement between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay, so now for the big controversy. What about using church resources for people outside of the church? The Old Testament does give us some advice on that question too. The tithes were used almost exclusively for the priest and Levites. That was their designated purpose. That was the intention of those resources, but there was that exception. Every 3 years, the tithe was kept behind, stayed in the communities to meet the needs of whatever people were within the gates, foreigners included. And so my proposal to you is maybe that should be given some consideration when we're thinking about the resources of the church. I strongly believe that the resources of the church are for the church. But sometimes, like in the law of Moses, it might make sense under specific conditions to use resources in other ways for strangers within the gates. I did not think that until about a year ago when I was looking at the Old Testament. And as I've said several times, we've got to interpret the New Testament and the Old Testament in ways that agree with each other. So my point is we need to do the right thing in whatever circumstances we're in. Okay, so I just told you that maybe under some circumstances it would make sense to use church resources for people outside of the church. So I think most people would want an example. What would that even look like? I am not saying that the church should be used for social benevolence. Not saying that whatsoever. The church resources are almost exclusively for the church. But I will give you an example. After Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast several years ago, I knew some electrical linemen who went down there to go help restore the electrical grid. It was an absolute catastrophe down there. The conditions were miserable. There was literally no place to stay, no place to eat, no place to go find food. But there was a local church that opened their doors to help. They let the linemen sleep at the building and even provided their meals for the week. This is not the kind of thing that we would normally do, right? Normally, we're not going to do that. But under specific situations, that is the most God-honoring thing to do. What are we going to say? Well, you can't stay here. This building's only for the church. You guys go sleep on the street. Do you see how in the effort to be super rigid about things, we can actually begin to dishonor God? So I'm just saying that under special considerations, when the circumstances make sense, maybe from time to time, it does make sense to help the stranger within the gate. So now that I have thrown out that grenade, what comments or questions do you have? You can speak. You don't have to not say anything. Did you have a comment? Yes, that's a great question. Yes. So the question is, does it matter where the proceeds come from? I do have a very specific answer to that. If I understand your question correctly, like where the church funds come from. Yes, I do think that matters. That's another principle that is laid out in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. 100% of the proceeds that funded these treasuries always came exclusively from among God's people. There was no bake sales, there was no special fundraisers, there was no garage sales or anything like that. It was always collections of free will donations from among the saints. That's the way they did it in the Mosaic Law. That's the only pattern that exists in the church. So I strongly advise that that's what churches do. If a church cannot fund, you might be getting more than what you asked for here, but this is a really good question. If a church cannot fund its activities exclusively by the free will offering of its members, then something has gone wrong. I don't necessarily know what it is, but something has gone wrong if a church can't fund its activities. Either A, everyone at church is too tight and not giving enough, or B, the church is using its resources on things that it shouldn't be using its resources on. So that's the biblical pattern I see. Very good question. Do you have other questions or comments about that? All right. I enjoyed doing that study. When I was doing the study for myself, I literally did go through every single time in the Old Testament that there was any collection of resources and any distribution of resources, because I felt like, well, maybe I don't know the whole story. Paul says that we should be referring to the Old Testament for patterns, not for rigid laws, but for patterns of the appropriate use of God's treasury. All right, so another thing that we can use the old law for, another very specific thing that is verified in the New Testament, is church discipline. The Mosaic system of justice required the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. This shows up several times throughout the Old Testament, including Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. One witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the matter shall be established. Does that phrase ever come up again in the New Testament? Several times. It's a valid principle that was first established under the Mosaic Law, and it's still true. It's still an appropriate way to govern the activities of the church, especially discipline within the church. 2 Corinthians 13, verses 1 and 2. Paul says, this will be the 3rd time I am coming to you. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word shall be established. I have told you before and foretell as if I were present the 2nd time. And now being absent, I write to those who have sinned before and to all the rest that if I come again, I will not spare. So he's using this principle in the context of the Mosaic Law, using the old law in the context of church discipline. Paul also appeals to this idea in 1 Timothy 5, verse 19. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Paul is saying that this is the right way to handle this sort of thing. If ever there is a question about a need for discipline in the church, including discipline against an elder, do not receive those accusations. Take no action until you have verified this from the witness of 2 or 3 people. So from all of this, we can make a few very important conclusions. The law should be used. It's a divine point of reference. That's the way I look at it. It should be used because it's a divine point of reference. The law should be used to clarify sin and righteousness. And the law should be used to clarify church practices like church finances, church order, and church discipline. There should be agreement between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So it should be used, but it also should not be misused. The law of Moses is only useful when we use it in the right way. And it is possible to misuse it, and many people do misuse it. This was Paul's warning in 1 Timothy 1, verses 5 through 8. Now, the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith, from which some, having strayed, have turned aside to idle talk. This is what went wrong, verse 7. Desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor the things which they affirm. But we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. So what Paul is saying is there are lawful ways of using the law, and there are also unlawful ways of using the law. When we bought our home in Eminence several years ago, the previous owner was a mechanic. He did all kinds of mechanicking, motorcycles, heavy equipment, and he was in such a hustle to leave the house. He left lots of things behind, including, by the way, his wet towel from his shower that morning. It was very odd. His dirty bed sheets were on the bed. Several pairs of shoes and clothing were in the closet. Every time I walked around the corner, I thought, is he still here? Is he going to pop out of the bathroom? Anyway, he left all kinds of things in his hustle to leave the house, including a whole bunch of very interesting tools. I became the owner of a car jack. I don't know what it's called. It's like one piece of metal like this and another piece of metal like this, and it goes like this. Does anybody know what that's called? I know it has a name. What's it called?
They use it old-time bumpers.
Okay, all right. Well, it looks super dangerous. I'm sure there's a perfectly safe way to use it, but it looks very dangerous. I just gave it away because I had no idea how to use it. I also inherited a very complex-looking coolant line pressure checker thing. So I'm sure that also has a technical name. Once again, I didn't know what to do with it. There was a number of other tools that I inherited that I could not name or describe. My point is, I had those tools at my disposal, and those tools would have been very useful to somebody who knew how to use them, but that somebody was not me. And I was not the right person to use those tools. And what I'm saying is, the Old Testament is like this. It can only be used carefully, thoughtfully, making sure we interpret it in a way that's in agreement with the New Testament. Like John said, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Christ. If we ever interpret the old law in a way that is out of line with the new law in Christ, then something has gone wrong. So we must use the law carefully. That's where I'm going to stop tonight. You've got maybe just 30 seconds or so to add one more comment or question if you want. Yes, go ahead.
What do you think about willing funds to making certain
So sad I'm out of time and I can't answer that question. I'm not sure. I'll just tell you the truth. I'm not sure. That sort of thing happens all the time, and it seems pretty harmless. Well, and here's the thing. That still fits the pattern, now that I'm thinking about it. That still fits the pattern of the Old and New Testament. That's a free will offering of a member, right? That's a free will offering of a member of the body of Christ, so that seems like it would be just fine. Yeah. The thing that I'm very uncomfortable with is when we start trying to recruit funding from outside the body of Christ. When we do that sort of fundraising, that seems out of line with the pattern. Good question. Thank you, everybody. We'll carry on tomorrow.